The blood-red sunset painted the Arizona sky as Ruby Newsom collapsed onto the dusty ground, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion after 3 days of walking. The year was 1882, and the 22-year-old had fled eastward from Prescott with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle of possessions tied in a shawl. Her dark hair, once neatly pinned, now hung in tangled waves around her face as she looked up at the approaching twilight, wondering if this desolate stretch between nowhere and nowhere would be where her story ended. Ruby had never imagined she'd end up alone in the wilderness, having spent most of her life as the dutiful daughter of a mercantile owner. But that life had shattered when her father died suddenly of fever, leaving debts that brought vultures circling. The worst of them, Franklin Walsh, had offered a simple solution: become his wife, and all would be forgiven. His yellowed smile and wandering hands had made her skin crawl, and when he tried to force himself on her after the funeral, Ruby had struck him with a fire iron and run. Now she was miles from anything resembling civilization, her water nearly gone, with only the vast, indifferent desert stretching before her. The distant silhouette of mountains suggested her destination, Jerome, the mining town she'd heard whispers about, where a distant cousin supposedly lived. Whether she would reach it seemed increasingly doubtful. As darkness descended, Ruby gathered what scrubby brush she could find and built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth in the lingering summer heat. She sipped the last of her water sparingly and chewed on a piece of jerky from her dwindling supplies. The stars emerged one by one, brilliant and cold against the vast blackness, until the heavens were alive with light. "At least the view is magnificent," she whispered to herself, trying to keep fear at bay. "A fine ceiling for my bedroom tonight." Sleep came in restless fits, interrupted by every nocturnal sound: the distant howl of coyotes, the rustling of creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind across the desert floor. Ruby curled tighter around her bundle, using it as a pillow, and prayed for morning. Dawn broke with the same merciless clarity as the night stars had shown, revealing her predicament in harsh light. Her lips were cracked, her throat parched, and the mountains still seemed impossibly distant. Ruby forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly as she gathered her few possessions. "One foot in front of the other," she told herself firmly, the words scraping against her dry throat. "That's all there is to it." She had walked perhaps an hour when she spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. At first, she feared it might be Walsh and his men come to drag her back. The thought gave her strength born of desperation, and she quickened her pace, though there was nowhere to hide in the sparse landscape. As the riders drew closer, Ruby could make out 4 horses and riders. Too few for a posse, she thought with some relief. Perhaps ordinary travelers who might spare some water. She stopped in her tracks, too exhausted to run, and waited as they approached. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, reined in his chestnut horse about 20 paces from her. The others, 2 rough-looking men and a younger, clean-shaven fellow, flanked him, regarding her with open curiosity. "Miss," the leader called, his voice deep and resonant, "you're a fair piece from anywhere out here. Are you lost?" Ruby squared her shoulders, aware of how she must appear disheveled, dusty, desperate. "Not lost, sir. Heading to Jerome. My family's expecting me." The man pushed his hat back, revealing a weather-beaten face with keen blue eyes. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's stubble and sun-bleached hair the color of wheat. "Jerome's still 15 miles east," he said, studying her with skepticism. "And that's rough country between here and there." His gaze moved to her empty hands. "You got any water?" Ruby hesitated, pride battling necessity. "I'm afraid not. Used the last of it this morning." The man nodded as if he'd expected this answer. He swung down from his saddle with easy grace and approached, leading his horse. Up close, she could see the trail dust on his buckskin vest and the worn leather of his boots. "Samuel Lawson," he said, extending a calloused hand. "These are my men Tom, Hank, and the boy there is Davy." Ruby took his hand briefly. "Ruby Newsom." Samuel unhooked a canteen from his saddle and offered it to her. "Drink slow, Miss Newsom. Too much too quick will make you sick." The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the sweetest thing Ruby had experienced in days. She forced herself to sip carefully, fighting the urge to gulp it all. "Thank you," she managed, returning the canteen after taking just enough to wet her throat properly. "You running from something, Miss Newsom?" Samuel asked, his gaze direct but not unkind. "Not many women travel these parts alone, especially without proper supplies." Ruby stiffened. "I'm not your concern, Mr. Lawson." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Out here, everyone's concern. Desert doesn't much care who you are or what your troubles might be, it'll kill you just the same." The younger rider, Davy, shifted in his saddle. "Boss, we ought to get moving if we want to make it to the ranch by sundown." Samuel nodded but kept his eyes on Ruby. "We've got a small spread about 5 miles north of here. You're welcome to ride with us, get some proper food and rest before continuing your journey." Ruby hesitated, years of caution warring with her desperate situation. "I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," Samuel said firmly. "It's common sense. You won't make Jerome today, not on foot and not in your condition, and another night in the open." He glanced at the cloudless sky. "Well, you'd be taking a gamble I wouldn't advise." The older man, Tom, spat to the side. "Ain't proper, boss, single lady and all." Samuel's jaw tightened. "My sister Martha's at the house. Miss Newsom will have proper chaperoning if that's your concern." Ruby weighed her options quickly. Trust these strangers or continue alone, risking death by exposure or worse. The decision, when viewed that way, was hardly a decision at all. "I would be grateful for your assistance, Mr. Lawson," she said with as much dignity as she could muster. Samuel nodded once, then turned to Davy. "She'll ride with you. Your mare's the gentlest." Minutes later, Ruby found herself perched behind the young cowhand, her bundle secured to the saddle, and her arms awkwardly circling his waist as they set off at a steady trot. Samuel rode ahead, occasionally glancing back as if to reassure himself she hadn't fallen off. The landscape changed gradually as they rode north, the flat desert giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and scrub oak. They crested a rise, and suddenly the Lawson Ranch spread before them, a modest cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley with a creek running alongside it. The main house was sturdy-looking, built of logs with a stone foundation, smoke curling from its chimney. A barn, corral, and several outbuildings completed the picture. As they approached, a woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. She wore a simple calico dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun. "That's Martha," Davy explained over his shoulder. "Sam's sister. She keeps us all in line." They dismounted in the yard, and Ruby found her legs unsteady after the ride. Samuel was at her side instantly, a steadying hand under her elbow. "Martha," he called, "we've brought a guest. This is Miss Ruby Newsom, heading to Jerome but caught out in bad circumstances." Martha Lawson approached, assessing Ruby with quick, intelligent eyes. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because her face softened into a welcoming smile. "You poor thing, you look half dead on your feet. Come inside and we'll get you sorted." Ruby allowed herself to be led into the house, which was simple but clean, with sturdy furniture and braided rugs on the plank floors. A large fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, and the smell of cooking food made her stomach clench painfully. "When did you last eat properly?" Martha asked, guiding Ruby to a chair at the kitchen table. I'm not entirely sure," Ruby admitted. "3 days ago, perhaps." Martha clucked disapprovingly and set about ladling stew from a pot hanging over the fire into a bowl. She placed it before Ruby along with a chunk of fresh bread. "Eat slowly," she cautioned, echoing her brother's earlier advice. "Your stomach won't be used to it." Ruby managed a few careful spoonfuls before the room began to swim before her eyes. The last thing she remembered was Martha's alarmed face and strong arms catching her before she hit the floor. She woke to filtered sunlight and the unfamiliar sensation of a real bed beneath her. For a moment, Ruby thought she might have dreamed everything: the flight from Prescott, the desperate journey, the cowboys who'd found her. Then she registered the rough-hewn beams of an unfamiliar ceiling and the sound of activity beyond the bedroom door. Sitting up cautiously, she discovered she was wearing a cotton nightgown that wasn't her own. Her clothes had been removed, and when she touched her hair, she found it had been washed and combed. The realization that someone Martha, she presumed, had tended to her while she was unconscious brought a flush of embarrassment to her cheeks. The bedroom was small but neat, with a washstand, chest of drawers, and a single chair beside the bed. A window framed by simple curtains looked out onto the ranch yard, where she could see men moving between the buildings, going about their morning chores. A soft knock sounded, and Martha entered carrying a tray with a steaming mug and a small plate of scrambled eggs. "Good morning," she said brightly. "You gave us quite a scare yesterday. Sam nearly rode for the doctor in Jerome, but I told him you were just exhausted and half-starved." Ruby pushed herself higher against the pillows. "I'm terribly sorry for the trouble." Martha waved away her apology. "No trouble. We couldn't very well leave you out there, could we?" She set the tray across Ruby's lap. "Now eat, but slowly, I know," Ruby finished with a small smile. Martha perched on the chair beside the bed. "Sam's filled me in a bit. Said you were heading to Jerome to meet family." Ruby hesitated, then decided truth was simpler than maintaining lies. "Not exactly. I have a distant cousin there, or had. I'm not certain she's still there. I'm running from a bad situation in Prescott." Martha nodded, unsurprised. "I thought as much. Well, your secrets are your own, but if there's anything you need, you only have to ask." "You've already done far more than I could have expected from strangers," Ruby said. "I'll be on my way to Jerome as soon as I'm able." "There's no rush," Martha assured her. "You'll need a few days at least to regain your strength, and it just so happens Sam's riding to Jerome next week for supplies. He could take you then if you'd like." Ruby considered this. A few days' rest would indeed do her good, and traveling with Samuel would be safer than continuing alone. "That's very kind. I wouldn't want to impose further, though. Perhaps I could help around the house while I'm here. Earn my keep," Martha smiled. "I wouldn't say no to an extra pair of hands. It's mostly men here, and while they're good workers, they track in more dirt than they clean up." She stood, smoothing her apron. "Your clothes are washed and drying. I've left one of my dresses on the chair there. It might be a bit large, but it'll do until yours are ready." After Martha left, Ruby finished her breakfast and dressed in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue cotton dress that hung somewhat loosely on her frame. She made her way cautiously out of the bedroom and found herself in a hallway with 3 other doors, presumably additional bedrooms. Following the sound of activity, she emerged into the main room she remembered from the previous evening. Martha was at the stove, while an older woman Ruby hadn't met was kneading bread dough at a large table. Both looked up as she entered. "There she is," Martha said cheerfully. Mrs. Abernathy, this is Miss Ruby Newsom. Ruby, this is Mrs. Abernathy, who comes in 3 times a week to help with cooking and cleaning. Mrs. Abernathy, a round-faced woman with gray streaked hair, nodded a greeting. Glad to see you up and about, miss. Them boys were mighty worried when you fainted dead away. Ruby felt heat rise to her face. I'm much better now, thank you. Sam and the men are out checking fence lines, Martha explained. They'll be back for the noon meal. In the meantime, why don't you sit? You still look a bit pale. Ruby shook her head. I've been enough of a burden. Please let me help. Martha exchanged a glance with Mrs. Abernathy, then shrugged. All right, you can help set the table. We feed 6 regularly, Sam, myself, and 4 ranch hands. Tom and Hank you met yesterday. Davy's our youngest, and then there's Miguel, who's been with us since Pa first started the ranch. Ruby set to work, grateful for the simple, familiar task. As she arranged plates and cutlery, she asked, Have you and your brother lived here long? Going on 8 years, Martha replied, stirring a pot of beans. Pa brought us out from Missouri when Sam was 20 and I was 18. Said there was opportunity in Arizona territory that you couldn't find back east anymore. He was right about that, though it hasn't always been easy. Your parents, Ruby began hesitantly. Both gone now, Martha said matter-of-factly. Pa's heart gave out 3 years back. Ma never made it west, died of pneumonia just before we were set to leave Missouri. I'm sorry, Ruby said quietly. My father passed recently as well. Martha nodded in understanding. It's hard being left to fend for yourself. Fortunately, Sam's a good brother and a better rancher. He's built this place into something Pa would be proud of. The door swung open, and Samuel himself entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He stopped short when he saw Ruby, surprise and something else, relief, perhaps flickering across his features. Miss Newsom, he said, nodding politely. Good to see you up and about. Mr. Lawson, Ruby returned, suddenly conscious of her borrowed dress and loose hair. Thank you again for your kindness yesterday. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Don't mention it, he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. His eyes, she noticed, were even bluer in the daylight, contrasting with his sun-bronzed skin. How are you feeling? Much improved, she assured him. Your sister has been very kind. Samuel smiled at Martha. She's good that way, takes after our ma. He crossed to the wash basin in the corner and began scrubbing his hands and face. Martha tells me you're bound for Jerome. You have work waiting there. Ruby hesitated. Not exactly. I'm looking for a fresh start. Samuel dried his face on a towel, studying her with those penetrating eyes. Jerome's a rough mining town, not the easiest place for a woman alone to make her way. I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Lawson, Ruby said with more confidence than she felt. A hint of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. I don't doubt it. Anyone who walks 3 days through Arizona desert has grit. He hung the towel on its hook. Still, if you're looking for work, we could use help here. Martha's been saying for months she needs another woman around the place. Martha shot him a surprised look. I have it that, but I didn't think you were listening, brother. Ruby blinked, taken aback by the unexpected offer. That's very generous, but I couldn't think about it, Samuel said simply. No need to decide right away. He glanced out the window. The men will be along shortly. I'd better wash up proper. After he disappeared down the hallway, Ruby turned to Martha with wide eyes. Is he serious? Martha laughed softly. Sam doesn't say things he doesn't mean, and he's right. I've been asking for help. Running a household for 5 men is no small task. She lowered her voice. Though I suspect his offer might have other motivations as well. What do you mean? Ruby asked, though something in her chest fluttered at the implication. Martha just smiled and returned to her cooking. Just that my brother has a soft spot for strays and lost causes. Always has. The next few days fell into a rhythm that Ruby found unexpectedly comforting. She helped Martha with household tasks, gradually regaining her strength and color. The men came and went, busy with the daily work of the ranch, mending fences, tending cattle, breaking horses. Samuel was often gone from dawn until dusk, but at mealtimes, she would catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression thoughtful. On the third day, Ruby was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the sound of hammering coming from behind the barn. Curious, she finished her task and followed the noise. Rounding the corner, she found Samuel and Miguel working on what appeared to be the frame of a small structure. Samuel, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscled forearms, was measuring a length of timber while Miguel held it steady. Neither noticed her at first, and Ruby took the opportunity to observe Samuel unawares. There was something compelling about the confident way he moved, the easy authority he commanded without seeming to try. "Miss Newsom," he said suddenly, looking up and catching her watching. "Did you need something?" Ruby felt her cheeks warm. "No, I was just curious about the noise. What are you building?" Samuel set down his saw and wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Another cabin. We've been meaning to add one for a while now. The bunkhouse is getting crowded with 4 men. It's going to be my place," Miguel explained with a grin. "The boss says I've earned my own 4 walls after 10 years of listening to Tom snoring." Samuel shrugged modestly. "It's overdue, and a man ought to have a place to call his own." Ruby stepped closer, examining the simple but sturdy framing. "It looks like it will be nice." "It'll do," Samuel said. 2 rooms, a proper stone fireplace, and windows ordered the glass special from Phoenix. He pointed to where rectangular spaces had been left in the framing. "Too many cabins out here are built like caves, dark all day long. A home should have light." Ruby was struck by the thoughtfulness behind this detail. "That's very considerate." Samuel met her eyes, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, perhaps. "Like I said, a home should be more than just shelter." That evening after supper, Ruby sat on the porch, watching twilight settle over the ranch. The air was cooling rapidly, as it did in the desert, but she found she didn't mind. After days of uncertainty and fear, the peace of this place was a balm to her spirit. The door opened behind her and Samuel emerged, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He offered one to her silently, then settled into the chair beside her. "Thank you," Ruby said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. They sat quietly for a while, watching as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "I'm riding to Jerome day after tomorrow," Samuel said eventually. "If you still want to go." Ruby stared into her coffee. The truth was, the thought of Jerome had become less appealing with each passing day at the ranch. "I've been thinking about your offer to work here." Samuel's hand stilled around his mug. "And I'd like to accept if it's still open." Ruby looked up at him. "At least for a time, until I figure out what comes next." The smile that spread across Samuel's face made something flutter in her chest. "It's still open," he said. "Martha will be pleased." "And you?" The question slipped out before Ruby could stop it. Samuel held her gaze, his expression serious now. "I'm pleased too, Miss Newsom." The next morning, Ruby helped Martha prepare breakfast as usual, but there was a new lightness to her movements. The decision to stay, even temporarily, had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Sam tells me you're staying on," Martha said as they kneaded dough for the day's bread. Ruby nodded. "If that's still all right with you." "More than all right," Martha assured her. "I've enjoyed having another woman around. And the men certainly eat better when there are 2 of us cooking instead of just me." She paused, flour dusting her hands. I've fixed up the small room off the kitchen for you. It's not much, but it'll give you more privacy than sharing my room." "That's very kind," Ruby said, touched by the gesture. "I don't know how to thank you all for taking me in like this." Martha waved away her gratitude. "That's how it is out here. People help each other. It's the only way to survive." She gave Ruby a sidelong glance. "Though I think Sam might have more than survival on his mind where you're concerned." Ruby nearly dropped the dough she was kneading. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Martha laughed. "Don't you? My brother's been acting different since you arrived. More aware. I haven't seen him shave 2 days running since Christmas last year, yet he's been neat as a pin every morning this week." Ruby felt heat rise to her face. "We barely know each other." "That's how it starts," Martha said wisely. "Just don't break his heart, Ruby. Sam's a good man, but he's had his share of disappointments." Before Ruby could respond, the subject of their conversation entered the kitchen, looking between them curiously. "What are you two whispering about?" he asked, reaching for a biscuit from yesterday's batch. "Women's business," Martha replied smoothly, swatting his hand. "Those are for the men's lunch pails." Samuel grabbed one anyway, winking at Ruby as he took a bite. "I'm riding out to the north pasture today. Won't be back till supper." He hesitated. "Unless you'd like to come along, Miss Newsom. Might be good for you to see more of the ranch now that you'll be staying." Ruby glanced at Martha, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that," she said, "though I'm not much of a rider." "The old mare, Daisy, is gentle as they come," Samuel assured her. "We'll take it slow." An hour later, Ruby found herself mounted on a placid brown mare, following Samuel's broader form as they rode away from the ranch buildings. She was wearing a spare pair of Martha's riding pants beneath her skirt, which made straddling the saddle much more manageable than it would have been otherwise. The morning was perfect, clear and cool, with just enough breeze to keep the heat at bay. As they rode, Samuel pointed out landmarks and boundaries, explaining the operation of the ranch in a way that made it clear how much he loved this land. "Pa chose well when he settled here," he said as they crested a rise that offered a view of the entire valley. "Good water, decent grazing. Close enough to Jerome and Prescott for supplies, but far enough to avoid the worst of the mining crowd's troubles." At the mention of Prescott, Ruby tensed slightly. Samuel noticed, of course. He seemed to notice everything. "You don't have to tell me what happened back there," he said quietly. "But if someone's looking for you, I should know, for the safety of everyone at the ranch." Ruby drew a deep breath. He deserved that much at least. "A man named Franklin Walsh. He held debts against my father's store. After Papa died, he made demands I couldn't meet." She lifted her chin. "When he tried to force himself on me, I defended myself and ran. He might be looking, but I doubt he'd track me this far. There are easier targets in Prescott." Samuel's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. "If he shows his face around here, he'll regret it." The fierce protectiveness in his voice stirred something in Ruby's chest. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I hope it won't come to that." They rode on in companionable silence for a while, eventually reaching a small stream where Samuel suggested they stop to rest the horses. He helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. They sat on a fallen log while the horses drank, the gentle sound of running water filling the silence between them. "Why did you really offer me a place here?" Ruby asked finally, voicing the question that had been nagging at her. "You don't know anything about me." Samuel considered this, picking up a small stone and turning it over in his fingers. "I know enough," he said. "I know you're brave. Walking across the desert alone proves that. I know you're honest. You could have spun any tale about why you were out there, but you didn't. And I know you're hardworking, from the way you've helped Martha these past days." He skipped the stone across the surface of a small pool. That's more than enough to go on, in my experience. Ruby studied his profile, the straight nose, the firm jaw, the eyes that seemed to see more than most. You're an unusual man, Samuel Lawson. He turned to her, a half-smile curving his lips. Is that good or bad? Good, she said without hesitation. Definitely good. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of possibilities neither had acknowledged before. Samuel's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, then returned to her eyes. Ruby, he said, her first name sounding different in his voice, more intimate somehow. The crack of a distant rifle shot split the air, making them both jump. Samuel was on his feet instantly, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. That came from the direction of the ranch, he said, tension radiating from him. We need to get back. The peaceful mood shattered. They mounted quickly and rode hard toward home, Ruby's heart pounding with renewed fear. Had Walsh somehow found her? Or was it something else entirely? Raiders, perhaps, or one of the cattle disputes Samuel had mentioned occurring occasionally in the territory. They crested the final rise above the ranch to see a scene of controlled chaos. Several horses Ruby didn't recognize were hitched outside the main house. Men were shouting, and smoke rose from somewhere behind the barn. Samuel spurred his horse faster, and Ruby followed as best she could, struggling to keep up on the placid mare. As they thundered into the yard, Martha burst from the house, her face pale with worry. "Sam," she cried. "Thank God you're back." Samuel dismounted in one fluid motion. "What's happened?" "Rustlers," Martha explained breathlessly. "They hit the south pasture. Miguel spotted them driving about 20 head toward the mountains. Tom and the boys rode after them, but they fired some shots. One hit the hay storage. We've got it under control now, but how many?" Samuel demanded, already checking his gun. 4, Miguel thought, masked. Samuel nodded grimly. "Stay here with Ruby. If they're not back in an hour, send Davy to Jerome for the marshal." He turned to Ruby, his expression softening slightly. "You'll be safe here. Martha knows what to do if trouble comes." Before Ruby could protest, he was back on his horse and galloping away, following the thin trail of smoke that marked where the confrontation had occurred. Martha put a steadying hand on Ruby's arm. "Come inside. There's nothing to do now but wait." The next hours were among the longest of Ruby's life. She and Martha moved mechanically through household tasks, both trying to distract themselves from worry. Ruby found herself glancing repeatedly at the clock on the mantel, watching the minutes crawl by. "Does this happen often?" she asked as they prepared a stew for supper, uncertain if anyone would be there to eat it. Martha shook her head. "Not for years. The territory's been getting more civilized, but there are always those who think stealing is easier than working." She sliced carrots with more force than necessary. "Sam will handle it. He always does." Just as the sun began to set, the sound of approaching horses brought them both rushing to the door. Samuel rode in first, followed by Tom, Hank, and Miguel. All looked dusty and grim, but unharmed. Behind them, 2 unfamiliar men sat slumped on their horses, hands bound, faces bruised. "Only caught 2 of them," Samuel explained as he dismounted. "The others got away with about a dozen head. We recovered the rest." He nodded toward the captives. "Davy's riding to Jerome for the marshal. These 2 will wait in the storage cellar until he arrives." Relief made Ruby's knees weak. "You're not hurt?" Samuel's expression softened when he looked at her. "Not a scratch. These aren't exactly hardened criminals, just opportunists who thought we'd be easy pickings." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Don't worry. This sort of thing doesn't happen often." That night, after the captured rustlers had been secured and a watch rotation established, Ruby sat with Samuel on the porch once more. The events of the day had left them both tired but too keyed up to sleep. I'm sorry your first week here had to include all this excitement, Samuel said, breaking a lengthy silence. Ruby shook her head. Don't apologize. If anything, it's shown me how quickly things can change out here, how important it is to be prepared. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. That's the truth of it. The West is still wild in many ways for all that civilization keeps pushing farther out. He glanced at her. Does it make you reconsider staying? No, Ruby said firmly. If anything, it makes me more certain. I'd rather face whatever comes with people I trust at my side. The look Samuel gave her then was so warm it seemed to touch something deep inside her. I'm glad to hear it, he said softly. The next morning, the marshal from Jerome arrived with 2 deputies to collect the rustlers. He was a grizzled man named Harkins who clearly had history with Samuel, greeting him like an old friend. Seems you're handling trouble same as always, Lawson, he remarked as his deputies led the prisoners away. Clean and quick. Samuel shrugged modestly. Just protecting what's mine. Marshal Harkins noticed Ruby standing nearby and raised an eyebrow. Don't believe I've had the pleasure, Miss Ruby Newsom, she introduced herself. I'm working for the Lawsons now. The marshal's gaze moved between her and Samuel, a knowing look crossing his weathered features. Is that so? Well, you found yourself a good place. The Lawson spread is one of the most respected in the territory. After the lawmen departed with their prisoners, life on the ranch gradually returned to normal. Ruby settled into her role, helping Martha with the household, and occasionally assisting with lighter ranch work when needed. She discovered she had a knack for bookkeeping, having learned the skill in her father's store, and soon took over managing the ranch accounts, a task Samuel was clearly relieved to relinquish. The small room off the kitchen became her own, decorated with a few treasured items from her bundle and small touches. Martha helped her add curtains sewn from scrap fabric, a braided rug, a small shelf for the books Samuel brought her from his trips to town. As summer gave way to fall, Ruby found herself watching the progress on Miguel's cabin with increasing interest. Samuel and the men worked on it during odd hours, and it was taking shape beautifully. The stone fireplace was complete, the roof was on, and the windows true glass windows. A rarity for a ranch hand's quarters gleamed in the autumn sun. One crisp October afternoon, Ruby carried coffee out to where Samuel was working alone on the cabin's interior. He was installing a set of shelves, his brow furrowed in concentration. I thought you might need this, she said, offering the steaming mug. It's getting chilly out here. Samuel looked up with a smile that never failed to quicken her pulse. Over the months, their relationship had evolved into a comfortable friendship, laced with something deeper, neither had put into words. They often found themselves alone together taking walks after supper, working side by side on ranch tasks, talking late into the evening after the others had gone to bed. You're an angel, he said, accepting the coffee gratefully. He gestured around the cabin's interior. What do you think? It's nearly done. Ruby looked around appreciatively. The cabin was simple but well crafted, with smooth plank floors and snug walls. The stone fireplace dominated one end of the main room, and the windows let in streams of golden afternoon light. It's wonderful, she said honestly. Miguel will be very happy here. Samuel took a sip of coffee, watching her over the rim of the mug. Actually, I've been thinking. He set down the coffee and his hammer, suddenly seeming almost nervous. Miguel's decided he'd rather stay in the bunkhouse. Says he's used to the company and doesn't fancy living alone. Ruby raised an eyebrow. After all this work, Samuel rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of uncertainty. Well, that's the thing. The cabin won't go to waste. He drew a deep breath. I thought maybe you might like it. Ruby stared at him, uncomprehending. "Me. Your room off the kitchen is so small," he explained quickly. "And I know you value your privacy. This would give you your own space, still close to the main house, but—" He trailed off, seeming to realize how the offer might sound. "That is, if you want to stay on more permanently. With us. With me." The last two words were spoken so softly Ruby nearly missed them, but their meaning hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her heart began to race as she understood what he was really saying. "Samuel," she began, unsure how to respond to this unexpected turn. He stepped closer, setting aside his tools entirely. "Ruby, I know this isn't how things are usually done. We haven't known each other long by some standards. But out here," he gestured to the vast landscape visible through the window. "Out here, life moves differently. We don't always have the luxury of time." Ruby found herself unable to look away from his earnest blue eyes. "What exactly are you saying?" Samuel took her hands in his calloused palms warm against her skin. "I'm saying that I built this cabin with you in mind. That from the moment I saw you standing alone in the desert, something in me recognized something in you." His voice lowered. "I'm saying I love you, Ruby Newsom, and I'd be honored if you'd consider making a life here. With me." Ruby's breath caught in her throat. The declaration was unexpected, yet somehow not surprising at all, as if she'd been waiting to hear those words without realizing it. "This is sudden," she managed, though the word felt wrong. Nothing about her feelings for Samuel felt sudden. They had grown gradually, naturally, like the changing of seasons. "Is it?" Samuel asked gently. "Haven't we been walking toward this since the day we met?" Ruby thought of all the moments that had led to this one, the kindness he'd shown her from the beginning, the quiet conversations on the porch, the way he listened when she spoke, truly listened in a way no man ever had before. She thought of how safe she felt in his presence, how the ranch had become more of a home to her in months than Prescott had been in years. "Yes," she said finally, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. "Yes, I suppose we have." Samuel's eyes lit with hope. Then yes," Ruby said, certainty filling her voice. "Yes to staying. Yes to this cabin. Yes to you, Samuel." His smile was radiant as he pulled her gently into his arms. "May I kiss you, Miss Newsom?" he asked, his voice husky. Ruby nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. When his lips met hers, the last piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving fell into place. His kiss was gentle but sure, like the man himself, and Ruby found herself responding with a passion she hadn't known she possessed. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably speak to the preacher in Jerome," he murmured. Ruby laughed softly, joy bubbling up inside her. "That would be the proper thing to do, Mr. Lawson." They walked hand in hand back to the main house, where Martha took one look at their faces and burst into tears of happiness. By supper time, the entire ranch knew that their boss and the woman he'd found wandering in the desert were to be married before Christmas. The weeks that followed were a flurry of preparation. The cabin was finished with renewed purpose, furnished with pieces Samuel commissioned from a craftsman in Jerome and items Martha insisted on contributing from the main house. Ruby sewed curtains and quilts, creating a home from the sturdy shell Samuel had built. Word spread through the scattered homesteads and ranches of the area, and neighbors Ruby had never met appeared bearing gifts and well wishes. She was touched by the warmth of this community, so different from the more formal society she'd known in Prescott. One week before the wedding, as Ruby was arranging her few possessions in the nearly completed cabin, she heard a horse approaching. Expecting Samuel, who had ridden to Jerome for supplies, She stepped onto the small porch with a welcoming smile that died on her lips when she saw the rider. Franklin Walsh sat atop a dappled gray horse, his fleshy face twisted in an unpleasant smile. He looked much as she remembered, overweight, overdressed, with small eyes that gleamed with mean intelligence. "Well, well," he said, his voice sending a chill down Ruby's spine. "If it isn't the runaway shop girl. You've led me quite a chase, my dear." Ruby's hand gripped the doorframe for support. "How did you find me?" Walsh chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. "Small territories have long memories. When I heard a Samuel Lawson was marrying a Ruby Newsom in Jerome, well, it wasn't hard to connect the dots." He swung down from his horse, making Ruby step back instinctively. "You're looking well. Better than when you left Prescott, certainly." Ruby straightened her spine, refusing to show fear. "What do you want, Mr. Walsh?" "What's rightfully mine," he said, his smile dropping. "You owe me, girl. Your father's debts didn't disappear when you ran." "I owe you nothing," Ruby said firmly. "Whatever arrangements you had with my father died with him." Walsh's face darkened. "That's not how business works, but I'm a reasonable man. There are ways to settle accounts that don't involve money." His gaze raked over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Come back to Prescott with me now and I'll forget the assault. Otherwise—" He patted his coat pocket significantly. "I have papers that could make life very difficult for you and your cowboy." Ruby's mind raced. The main house was empty. Martha had gone to visit a neighbor, and the ranch hands were all working the far pastures. Samuel wouldn't be back for hours. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is my home now." Walsh snorted. "Home?" "A glorified shack in the middle of nowhere." He stepped closer. "Don't be foolish, Ruby. You don't belong here. You're a town girl, educated, wasting yourself on a dirt farmer when you could have position and comfort." "Samuel Lawson is worth 100 of you," Ruby said, anger replacing fear. "And I'd rather live in a glorified shack with him than a mansion with a man like you." Walsh's expression hardened. "I see he's filled your head with romantic nonsense. No matter. You're coming with me one way or another." He reached for her arm. Ruby reacted without thinking, shoving him hard. Walsh, unprepared for resistance, stumbled backward off the small porch, landing ungracefully in the dirt. "You little—" he sputtered, struggling to his feet. The sound of approaching horses interrupted whatever threat he'd been about to make. Ruby's heart leapt as she recognized Samuel's chestnut in the lead, with Tom and Hank riding beside him. They must have met on the trail back. Samuel took in the scene instantly. Ruby on the porch, Walsh disheveled and angry in the yard. His face went very still in a way Ruby had come to recognize as dangerous. "Who might you be?" he asked Walsh, his voice deceptively calm as he dismounted. Walsh brushed dirt from his expensive coat, trying to regain his dignity. "Franklin Walsh of Prescott. I've come to collect Miss Newsom. She has outstanding obligations to me." Samuel's gaze flicked to Ruby. "Is that so?" "He holds my father's debts," Ruby explained, descending the porch steps to stand beside Samuel. "Or claims to. He wants me to return to Prescott as payment." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Mr. Walsh, I suggest you get back on your horse and leave my property." Walsh drew himself up. "This isn't your concern, Lawson. The girl and I have business that predates whatever arrangement you've made with her." "That arrangement, as you call it, will be a marriage in 6 days' time," Samuel said, his patience visibly thinning. "And anything that concerns Ruby concerns me," Walsh sneered. "How touching. But unless you can produce $400, she's coming with me. I have the legal right." Samuel studied the older man for a long moment, then turned to Tom. "Ride to the house. In my desk drawer there's a cash box. Bring it here." Tom nodded and spurred his horse toward the main house, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Ruby touched Samuel's arm. "Samuel, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he said quietly. "If money will end this, it's a small price." Walsh watched this exchange with calculating eyes. "Perhaps I've undervalued my claim, the debt plus interest and damages for her assault on my person. Let's call it an even 1,000. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "You said 400. "I've reconsidered," Walsh said smugly. Before Samuel could respond, Tom returned with a small metal box. Samuel took it, his expression unreadable as he counted out bills. 400, he said, holding out the money to Walsh. "Not a penny more." "The debt is settled." Walsh made no move to take it. "As I said, my terms have changed." Samuel's patience snapped. In one swift movement, he grabbed Walsh by his fancy lapels and pushed him against the nearest post. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll take this money and leave. You'll sign whatever paper releases Ruby from any obligation to you, and you'll never show your face in this valley again." He leaned closer. "Because if you do, I'll make sure everyone from here to Prescott knows how you tried to force yourself on a grieving daughter, how you're trying to use fraudulent debts to coerce women, how you're nothing but a coward who preys on those he thinks can't fight back." Walsh's face had gone pale, his earlier smugness vanishing in the face of Samuel's controlled fury. "You can't threaten me. I'm a businessman of standing, and I'm a man protecting what's mine." Samuel cut him off. "Take the money and go. It's more than generous." For a tense moment, Ruby thought Walsh might refuse. Then something in Samuel's eyes seemed to convince him of the futility of his position. He sagged slightly and nodded. "Fine," he muttered. 400, but I want a receipt signed by her, acknowledging payment in full." Samuel released him and stepped back. "Tom, fetch paper and pen from the house. Hank, keep an eye on our guest." Within the hour, Ruby had signed a document releasing her from all obligations to Walsh, real or imagined, and he had departed with the money tucked securely in his coat. They watched him ride away, dust rising behind his horse as he disappeared over the ridge. "I'm sorry," Ruby said quietly when he was gone. "I should have told you he might come." Samuel turned to her, his earlier anger replaced by concern. "Are you all right?" Ruby nodded, suddenly exhausted by the confrontation. "Yes, just shaken." Samuel pulled her gently into his arms. "It's over now, he won't be back." "How can you be sure?" she asked against his chest. Men like Walsh only understand one language: self-interest. He got his money. Coming back would only bring him trouble. Samuel kissed the top of her head. "Besides, after we're married, he'll have even less claim." Ruby looked up at him, overwhelmed by the steadfast protection he offered so naturally. "I love you, Samuel Lawson." His face softened into the smile she'd come to cherish. "And I love you, Ruby Newsom, soon to be Lawson." The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the December air crisp with the promise of winter. The ceremony was to be held at the ranch, in the main house decorated with evergreens and whatever late-blooming flowers Martha had managed to coax from her garden. Ruby stood in her new cabin, Martha helping her with the simple white dress they'd sewn together. It wasn't fancy by Eastern standards, no lace or beading, just good cotton with careful stitching, but Ruby thought it more beautiful than any store-bought finery. "You look radiant," Martha said, adjusting the small cluster of dried flowers in Ruby's hair. "Sam won't know what hit him." Ruby smiled nervously. "Do you think your parents would have approved?" "Of me?" Martha's hand stilled for a moment. "They would have loved you," she said with conviction. "Pa always said Sam needed someone with spirit to match his own, and Ma would have appreciated your practical nature." She squeezed Ruby's shoulders gently. They'd be happy to see him so happy. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Miguel, who had offered to escort Ruby to the main house. The ranch hand was barely recognizable in his Sunday best, his usually unruly hair slicked down with some kind of pomade. "Miss Ruby," he said with a respectful nod. "Everyone is waiting. The preacher has arrived from Jerome." The walk from the cabin to the main house had never seemed so long. Ruby's heart pounded as she approached, Miguel on one side and Martha on the other. They'd kept the guest list small, just the ranch hands, a few neighbors, and the preacher, but it felt like the entire territory must be watching as she crossed the yard. Samuel stood waiting on the porch, more handsome than she'd ever seen him in a new black suit. His face when he saw her held such naked adoration that Ruby nearly stumbled. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Ruby heard herself repeating vows, felt the cool band of gold slide onto her finger, saw the preacher's approving smile as he pronounced them husband and wife. And then Samuel was kissing her, his lips warm against hers as the small crowd cheered and whooped. "Mrs. Lawson," he murmured against her ear as they turned to face their guests. "Welcome home." The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and music and more happiness than Ruby had thought possible after the dark days following her father's death. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the yard where impromptu dancing had broken out. Samuel found her sitting on the porch steps, watching Tom attempt to teach Mrs. Abernathy a lively jig. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked, extending his hand. Ruby placed her hand in his, allowing him to pull her to her feet. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Samuel admitted as he led her into the yard. "We'll learn together." They swayed more than danced, holding each other close as the fiddle music slowed to something more suited to their limited skills. Ruby rested her head against Samuel's chest, hearing the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Happy?" he asked softly. Ruby nodded, unable to find words adequate to express the fullness in her heart. 6 months ago, she'd been alone in the desert, certain her life was ending. Now she stood in the circle of her husband's arms, surrounded by people who had become family, with a future stretching before her bright with promise. "More than I ever thought possible," she whispered. Later, after the guests had departed and the ranch had quieted, Samuel led Ruby back to their cabin. He had insisted on carrying her over the threshold, an Eastern tradition Martha had mentioned that made Ruby blush and Samuel grin. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, a fire burning low in the stone hearth. Samuel had arranged surprises she hadn't seen before: a new quilt on the bed, a small bookshelf filled with volumes she'd admired in the Mercantile in Jerome, a rocking chair positioned perfectly to catch the morning light through the east window. "When did you do all this?" Ruby asked, running her fingers over the spines of the books in wonder. "I've been planning it for weeks," Samuel admitted, "with some help from Martha and the boys." Ruby turned to him, overwhelmed by this evidence of his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect, all of it." Samuel took her hands, his expression serious despite his smile. "When I found you out there, alone under the stars, something told me you were meant to cross my path. I didn't understand it then, but I do now." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You were the missing piece, Ruby. The one that makes this place truly home." Ruby reached up to touch his face, memorizing the contours of it by touch. "And you built me a home with windows," she said softly, "so I'd never be in darkness again." Their kiss sealed promises unspoken of love, of loyalty, of a shared future built on the foundation they'd already begun together. Spring came early to the Arizona territory that year, bringing with it the promise of new life. The ranch flourished under Samuel and Ruby's joint care, with Ruby's keen business sense complementing Samuel's practical knowledge of the land. The books showed better profits than ever before, allowing them to hire additional hands and expand their herd. Ruby's cabin, their home, became known for its hospitality. Neighbors stopped by for Ruby's coffee and conversation, and even Marshall Harkins made a point of visiting whenever he was in the area. The windows Samuel had insisted on filled the small space with light from dawn until dusk, just as he'd promised they would. On a warm evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ruby laid her head on Samuel's shoulder. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice soft but sure. Samuel turned to her, eyebrows raised in question. "What is it?" Ruby took his hand and placed it gently over her still flat stomach. "Come November, we'll need to make room for one more in our cabin." Samuel's face transformed with wonder and joy. "Truly," he whispered. Ruby nodded, her own happiness reflected in his shining eyes. "Truly." His whoop of delight startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree as he swept her into his arms, spinning her around on the porch before setting her gently back on her feet. "Careful," Ruby laughed. "We're going to need to be more dignified parents." Samuel kissed her soundly. "I make no promises about dignity, but love and protection, those I can guarantee." As twilight deepened around them, Ruby leaned into her husband's embrace, watching as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Once, not so long ago, those same stars had been her only shelter, cold and distant above her desperate journey. Now they were simply beautiful, a canopy over the home and life she and Samuel had built together. "I never thought I'd be grateful for being lost in the desert," Ruby mused. "But if I hadn't been, I might never have found you." Samuel's arms tightened around her. "You weren't lost," he said softly against her hair. "You were on your way home, you just didn't know it yet." Through the open door of their cabin, lamplight spilled golden onto the porch, beckoning them inside to warmth, to safety, to the life they continued to build day by day. Hand in hand, they answered its call, closing the door on the vastness of the desert night, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, in the home he had built with windows to let in the light. In November of 1883, Sarah Elizabeth Lawson made her arrival after a difficult but ultimately successful birth attended by Martha, and a midwife from Jerome. Samuel had paced outside the cabin for hours, deaf to the reassurances of the ranch hands, until his daughter's first cry split the autumn air. When Martha finally allowed him inside, the sight of Ruby cradling their tiny daughter with exhausted triumph rendered him momentarily speechless. "She has your eyes," Ruby said softly, as he knelt beside the bed to meet his daughter. "And your spirit, I'd wager," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion as a tiny hand wrapped around his finger. The years that followed were filled with the joys and challenges of building both a family and a prosperous ranch. Sarah grew into a spirited child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. She was joined 2 years later by a brother, James, who inherited Samuel's quiet thoughtfulness and steady nature. The cabin Samuel had built was expanded twice, first to add a bedroom for the children, and later to create a larger gathering space where friends and neighbors could congregate for the social events Ruby organized. But through all the changes and additions, the windows remained Samuel's pride, large, clear panes that filled their home with light and views of the landscape they both loved. Ruby never forgot those desperate days when she had slept under the stars with no shelter, but the memory lost its power to frighten her. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far she had come, and of the extraordinary man who had found her when she most needed finding. And on nights when the Arizona sky was particularly brilliant with stars, she and Samuel would sometimes sit on their porch, children asleep inside, and look up at the same vast canopy that had once been her only roof. But now, instead of fear and loneliness, those stars represented possibility and the mysterious workings of fate that had brought her to exactly where she was meant to be, in a home filled with love, with windows open to the future.